scripture this morning follows last week's Matthew text. Last week, Matthew was about feeding the 5,000. Did you forget already? This story picks up immediately, and the word is actually immediately. We hear these words. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I invite you to pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I remember my first ever boat ride. It was at Indian Lake. And I was probably 6 or 7 years old. And we were camping there. We were camping with some friends. And my dad always went fishing early in the morning with a man named Meredith Green. They got up that early that morning, went fishing. And apparently while they were fishing, something happened to the boat motor. So they came back, and my dad brought the fish back that they had caught, and they went to work on the motor, and so I went along. So they worked on it, and finally got it running, and decided they needed to take it for a test ride. So I decided that I would go. And if you're familiar with the state park at Indian Lake, you know, you go out the channel, and that really wasn't a big deal. We headed out the channel, got out there a little ways, and then we took the hard left. And as soon as we took the hard left, I remember this like it was yesterday. I'm surprised I can ride in a boat today. As soon as we took a hard left, I'm not kidding you, the waves were 20 feet high. We got smashed and buffeted and tossed and turned. I swear to you, we were going to crash against the rocks. We went up and down and over. We probably flipped over 3 or 4 times. Okay, well, maybe not. But I remember it as a rough ride. I remember being scared to death. I wasn't very old. I'd never ridden on a boat before. Those waves probably weren't very high. They were probably just rocking us a bit. It felt like that day that we were going to capsize. I was never so glad to get back into the channel where it was safe. My next boat ride was as an older teenager with my friend Shauna and her parents. And we did the same thing. They had a cabin there. We go out on the lake. We hadn't gone very far. The waves must have been worse than the previous boat ride. Because what I remember from that boat ride is my head hanging over the edge. Yeah. I don't know. I can ride boats now without any trouble. But I was traumatized early in life. Jesus has fed all of these people, and the disciples have been engaged in this conversation with all of those around. And night came, and Jesus said to the disciples, "Get in the boat and go across the lake, and I'll join you later," as he dismissed the crowd. And so the disciples, as they are, get in the boat, go out of the channel, head out into the lake, and apparently the waves began to buffet them. We hear the story, right? They're out there and they're holding on for dear life. Maybe they felt like me, they were going to capsize. And in the midst of that rocking and the waves and their fear, because the scripture is clear, isn't it? They were afraid. They were afraid of the waves because their boat was being buffeted. But then they look out and see this ghost, by all accounts, walking on water. And they cry out in fear, and Jesus simply says, guys, calm down. It's me. I'm coming to you. And Peter, we've heard the story a lot, right? Peter cries out, Lord, if it's you, let me come out there. And Jesus says, okay, come on out. And Peter goes out there, as Holly said, took his eye off the ball, and began to sing. Now, I think there's lots of approaches to this story that we can take. Probably, we are sometimes like Peter, right? If you would think about how we live our lives, there's much conversation, you've even heard it from me, there's much conversation about living outside the box, about taking chances, about being a step ahead, about being on the cutting edge, and always living on the edge. We sometimes take great pride in being like Peter sometimes, if we're out front, if we're on the cutting edge, if we're being all that we think we ought to be, and even if we leave the crowd behind, we think we're doing the right thing. And maybe for some situations and in some ways that's an okay place to be, that we lift our leg, I wish I could, lift our leg over the side of the boat and get out. While the others in the boat, one, calls out, two, stand in amazement. Most likely, those left in the boat are just shaking their head, thinking we ought to stay in the boat. Now, Jesus says to Peter this interesting thing, come on out. And immediately, Peter begins to sink because of all the action of the water around him. And Jesus takes his hand and brings him back into the boat and says, you have little faith, why did you doubt? I just wonder, as I'm reading this story, as I think about God's call on us, if just maybe what Jesus says to Peter, and maybe says to us in this story about jumping out of the boat, is that just maybe what Jesus really says to Peter is, why didn't you stay in the boat, for goodness sake? Sometimes it's not advantageous to get out of the boat. Sometimes what God calls us to isn't being a loner, isn't being way out in front of everybody else and taking every chance and living our faith on the edge. But maybe, just maybe, God's call on us and on Peter that day and on the disciples gathered in the boat was really a call to community. Tuesday night we had the pleasure of hosting National Night Out again, and it was great. We had a lot of fun, and lots of people came. We gave out lots of hot dogs, besides the ones that Pete and I ate. That was only a couple. That was lots of hot dogs. and lots of prizes to lots of kids. And I made about as many snow cones as I could possibly make. Snow cones were a huge hit that night. And people came from all over the neighborhood. And they gathered and they shared the conversation. Actually, folks stayed around until we started cleaning up. They just gathered and shared the conversation and the story. And conversations happened in all kinds of places. And kids went down the slide probably a million times, Mike. At least a million times. Again and again and again. And we, together, as the body our community. Did you see the picture on the front page of the Sydney Daily News? The front page. Now, we didn't do that to get front page press and to say, look at what St. Paul's did, jumping out of the boat and sharing in this gift. Instead, what I told the reporter and what he said at the very end, he says, what's the purpose of this? And I simply said to him, it's for us to get to know our neighborhood and the neighborhood to get to know us. None of us jumped out of the boat. None of us had to walk on water. None of us had to be extraordinary and do great things to make a difference. But instead, we simply, as Jesus calls to the disciples, we simply had to be in community. And we did that together. Some folks never left the bingo table, did they, Bob? I didn't think so. And little kids and older kids are walking around with snakes, putting them in their pastor's face when they know he doesn't like them. Stuffed or not. And paintings of things on their cheeks. And even Ronnie had something painted on his face. Brown. The Browns? Oh, good. And Rob stirred the ducks with his cane. You see, sometimes being in the boat, sometimes not jumping over the side makes a lot of sense. Because what happens when you jump over the side? What happens when you decide to be a loner? What happens when you decide to blaze a new trail without anyone coming with you? What happens? Sometimes, not always, but sometimes you fizzle out, right? You go blaze a new trail and you look back and everybody else is standing back there saying, I don't think so. If it was so great to jump out of the boat, the rest of the disciples probably would have jumped out of the boat. I'm not saying what Peter did was wrong. But I think for us to hear this story clearly, we have to put ourselves in all of their shoes. They had just fed 20,000 plus. They had just encountered this miracle with 12 baskets full of food left over. They're out in the boat by themselves and the waves are buffeting them. Jesus comes, and in the midst of the buffeting, in the midst of their fear, in the midst of the unknown of what's about to happen, and this apparent ghost walking across the water, in the midst of all of that, Jesus comes, climbs back in the boat with Peter, and the waves calm. I think God's call on us is much like that. The waves of life smack us around. And it seems like sometimes, like I felt when I was 7, that we're just going to capsize. And Jesus calls us to community. Jesus calls us to building each other up. Jesus calls us to a great amount of faith, knowing that we're not left to ourselves. I would venture to guess if we're going to step out of the boat, we better take somebody with us. Otherwise, we should stay in the boat and be the people of God. Let us pray. Thank you, God, for this great story, this reminder that apart from you just going on our own, we often fail and fall short. We look to you, God, to be with us in all of our lives. And when we venture out, help us to keep our eye on you. And when you call us to community, help us to respond in that kind of way. builds up those arms. We give you thanks, God, for this story.